But do you consider that females had that virtue and lost it?
Yes.
I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, like throughout history, what you've seen is not that females had virtue; it's that females had the lack of ability to say no. I mean, you basically had the
It's not
vast
what
majority
you
of
what I see in
population
the historic
replace.
record.
Wait,
Go ahead.
what I'm saying, no, what we're not talking about is the aristocracy. What we're talking about is the everyday people, in that the majority of people were reproduced through like brides and war slaves and things like that.
That's
Like
bullshit.
that's where the babies got born.
No,
The
that's
the
bullshit.
the the everyday farmer would have lots of children
No.
because he needed people to tend the
No,
farm.
what happened was this.
Like,
Here's most of human history, and you can just look at medieval Europe, and you can look at the pre-pleb
which I have.
societies,
So
and you can look at the pre-pleb societies which existed in Norway, which existed in all of these places. Men and women generally worked on the same plot of land in some type of trade. Okay, they worked
sure,
together. Men would
sure,
let's say you were a blacksmith or something like this. You generally would work off your own land, okay, and
sure.
usually that land was held by some type of jarl or
Some
franklin
member of the
or
aristocracy.
some type of some type of holder of the aristocracy, and you would pay duties to whoever that knight was or whoever that jarl was or whoever it was on
Sure.
behalf of that land for life. And they were usually pretty reasonable duties because you had a skill. The women or wife would operate in a support role. They weren't just taking care of the children; they were also washing clothes. They were also assisting with
Hmm.
boot mending. They were assisting with various things, activities. They worked cooperatively. They didn't work in a sense where the man would just beat the shit out of them and grape them all day. That's all feminist bullshit.
That's not what I
But it
said.
was what you
That's not
said.
what I
You
said.
said most
No, it
children were
isn't. No,
born
it isn't.
of and savagery and this, and
What I was talking
it's
what
not true.
but that's not what I said. What I said is they were the products of war, in that a vast majority of the children that were born, a vast majority of the wives that were taken as the result of war.
That is not
And
true. That is
it is
not
true.
true.
It
No,
is
it's
true.
not true.
Especially it's true in the bigger empires of our
Most
time. The
wives were
empires of our
not.
time, this is what they
No,
did.
no. Most
This is
wives,
how new
no.
societies were even built.
Okay,
It, like,
first of all, the fall of great societies takes a long, 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 long time. Okay,
so
and
is the
even the
building
fall,
of them.
even the small of small, or even the fall of small societies conquered by larger ones, it's an encroachment that takes a long time to do. Most marriages were not done because of war brides. Did this happen in history?
No, I
Sure,
didn't say
but
most of
the
marriages, I said
vast,
most
vast
reproduction, but
majority,
okay.
the vast majority of children born were born of a completely consensual relationship between men and women who cooperated together with the man's rightful state of authority in the homestead. And that was how it worked from the top down. It couldn't work any other way because they were the only ones who could secure the fucking land, dude. They're the only ones
It had
who ever
nothing to
can
do with
secure the
securing
land.
land, though. It had to do with taking land that basically wasn't even theirs. It was called conquering land, and that's how you secured it. You
No, if
secured it
you're
by
no, no, no. If you
planting
were on
your
a
flag.
knight's, if you're on a knight's property, a knight who is
Hmm.
given holdings from a lord, okay, this knight, his job is to protect that land, and you were a part of an unorganized body of militia who that knight could call up if the king needed warriors. And so this is where the old saying came: pound your hoes into plowshare or your plowshares into
I
swords,
know.
and then pound your swords back into plowshares. The idea
Sure.
there was if you were a farmer, right, and you got called up for your militia training from your knight, from the local knight, you had to go. You were protecting your land. That and you were the only ones who could. So you had the necessary authority to do that. Under the democratic under democratic egalitarianism, such a thing still exists where men are the required um portion of society to give security to that society. But we have moved away from the idea of any duties for women, with instead women taking advantage of such security, right? Especially immigrant women from war torn countries, all sorts of women, okay? Without the duty being there for them to act in a way which is reproductive and towards the family and towards society.
So, first of all, I'm not talking about just the individual middle class, so to say, of history. There's a reason why the entire Western Hemisphere, with the exception of the US and Canada, speaks Spanish. And that's because the Spanish came and they killed the men and they impregnated the women and they took them as they needed to and created Mexicans. Like these
Mestizos, yeah,
type of thing.
mestizo.
Right. But what I'm saying is that throughout history, the great empires would slaughter the men and take the women and incorporate them into their society, not in a way where they were working hand in hand to
No,
create a better plot of land. They were
no.
repopulating and taking care of each
Look, I
other,
can demonstrate.
not
I can
based on
literally
duty, but based
demonstrate
out of
this. I
necessity.
can demonstrate this. It's not that this didn't
Okay,
happen. You're right.
let's
It
go
is.
ahead.
It is the case that this did happen. But when you're talking about even your example here for mestizos, when Spaniards came, the Spaniards killed very few natives. Smallpox killed about 90% of them. Okay. And by the way, it was
It
considered
wasn't
taboo.
90%, it was about 60%, but I
No,
hear
it
you.
was about 90%. But anyway, the here's the thing that's so funny about this too. It was considered a social taboo to marry one of these quote savages. This was not something that the Christians wanted at all. The Spanish Christians were saying, no, you shouldn't marry them. They're not part of the faith. This is bad, right? They're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the domestication was for Christianity. That's true, but that came later. Not only that, but here's the dead proof, Halsey. Here's what
Sure.
genetic data shows. I got it in front of me. 89% of women and 40% of men have been able to reproduce. How could that be if it's all rape, Halsey? How could
Come
that
again?
be? How could it be that
No, read the
89%
stat
of
again.
women have been able to reproduce, but only 40% of men? How's that the case if it's all
89%
rape?
of women have been able to reproduce,
Yeah,
meaning that they've successfully had children?
yeah, and only 40% of men.
I mean, doesn't that prove my point? If
No,
40% of men are impregnating 89% of women, that it would stand to
that wouldn't be
reason
rape, bro.
that men were
No, that would show that women
impregnating
have
multiple women?
nope, that would show that women have been able to have traditionally sexual selection and men have not. If men were just raping everybody, they would have access to sexual selection, right? Because you would still see genetic diversity
Well,
because they'd be raping all the women, Halsey.
and they were, but I'm
Yeah,
saying
but they
I don't
wouldn't.
understand. If
Otherwise, we would
80% of
see
women
a
are
gene
becoming
pool of
pregnant from
selection,
40%
bro.
of men, then
Yeah.
you wouldn't see the destruction of certain cultures. You would see the destruction of certain people. They wouldn't all be
Why
intermixed and
wouldn't you,
breeded
bro? Why wouldn't you?
finding and why wouldn't you? If
Yeah.
40% of men were breeding with 89% of women, you
Yeah.
would see genetic bottlenecks.
No, it's because of things like harems. It's because of things like men who had great status would have multitudes of wives, but they weren't war brides.
Right.
And the thing is that if it is the case
Where did harem women come from?
that most of these things were the product of right, then you should see a much more diverse genetic pool from men because they would just what grab a woman and rape her, right, Halsey? But they weren't
But you
allowed
do
to
see
do,
that genetic
bro.
diversity.
They
You see it
weren't
amongst
allowed to do
even
that,
native populations. You see
bro.
it everywhere.
You don't see
You
it
see you see you see
if
Hispanics from the
40% of
same
men,
areas that go from
bro,
super light to super
if
dark. Yes,
40%
you do.
of men,
You see all kinds
Halsey,
of genetic
it doesn't make sense, Halsey. I'm showing
sure
you,
it does.
literally. Okay, tell me how.
Because as I just said, if 40% of men are breeding with 89% of women, then you're seeing a genetic dispersal from men to women that include multiple women from singular men.
That
You're
would be
seeing a
polygamy, not
that's not polygamy. It wasn't
yes,
that
it's
everybody had
polygamy.
just had multiple
Well,
wives. No,
polygyny.
that's not the case.
Yes, it is the case. It's the case that men of high status had the option to marry multitudes of women,
How
okay?
many men of
And
high
men of
status do you
low
think there were?
status did not.
How many men of high status do you think there were that
Between
40% of men
yeah, so
could breed 89% of women?
between the merchant class and the noble class, right? I would say, oh, I don't know, somewhere around 40% of men. That would be what I would
You
consider
think
to be the noble
40% of
class.
men were of the merchant noble class in
Yes.
all of South and
Yeah,
Central America?
about 60 to 65% among the peasant class, not in the nobility or the aristocracy or
No,
the merchant class.
I don't accept that.
Well,
I
you
don't
cannot
accept
accept it all
that.
you want, but it's due to the fact of harems. If it were the case that men
So you're
that
saying that
bro,
everyone in Middle America
if it
had
were the
harems,
case,
and
if it
that's why the seed
were
was spread among such
not
women.
middle America, what are you talking about?
That's what I'm talking about. That's what I just said like
Yeah,
5 times
when you're talking about
when
native,
you're talking about the
yeah.
spreading of empire to the entire
Mhm.
Western Hemisphere, with the exception of Canada and the US, you're
Yeah.
seeing a great diversity of women having births and not a large amount of men. That's the stat you just read.
Yeah, but I don't understand how this is tied in. You're making the claim historically the standard was that most children were born of that
I
is
didn't say
that
okay. What I said
hang on, that is
is that
historically not true.
there was what I'm saying is that a man would marry a wife and he would go off to war and there would be a great many impregnations that came from those men who won the war that had nothing to do with their wives, and they would come back to their wives and no one would know whoever impregnated all the women along the way, but they absolutely were.
Yeah,
And
the
also a
vast
lot of the men,
majority of women inside of nations which are conquered were not Halsey. That is fictitious
really, what
history.
then they were not. They were
They
not.
were not. Not
They
even
just
not
they just
even
went on
not
to
even
never have children.
When the Russians went through Berlin, right after the fall,
In the 40s?
yeah, and when Russians went through Berlin, they called it the Rape of Berlin for a reason because they
I
really
know.
did. So many women, it was unbelievable. Like that was insane.
Well,
But they didn't
could be
most of
argued
German
one
but
could argue
Halsey,
that.
most German women never got in that war. I don't know what to tell you. Berlin, definitely this isolated area, definitely a lot of that happened, but most German women were not in that war, Halsey. Most Russian women were
I
not in
think
that
so.
war, Halsey. Like what I'm saying to you is that if you look at the historic standard, the reason this genetic diversity doesn't exist, it's 40% to 90% is because of harems, because men of great means could afford many, 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 many wives. That was the case in Islam. It was the case in Christian nations. It was the case in non-Christian nations. It has always been the historic case that men of great means could afford many, many wives and had the resources to have them. Not because of
Okay,
rape,
so I'm saying
bro.
then how come that there aren't vast amounts of stories in Europe and as I said, Middle America, Central America, South America? Like, yes, I understand in Islamic countries you hear about great harems, but I've never heard about great harems in the middle areas. Like, look at the aristocracy. You actually knew who most of the women were, and the only reason that they would have multiple wives is because their wives died in childbirth,
You did
and they
hear
would marry
about
new
bro, you've
wives.
heard about great harems all over the world until polygyny became the order or polygyny got destroyed for monogamy, the order of the day. But that's a relatively new
But
system.
the
Even
monogamy
under
came
Jew
about in the
hang on.
2000s.
Let
I
me
mean,
ask you a question. Have you
in the
ever heard
beginning of
of King
the
David? You ever heard of King David?
what?
King
Sure.
David. Did he have a few
18
wives?
wives. 18.
Yeah. And was he famously quoted as saying, "I've spent many seasons between the legs of women, of many
Sure.
women"? Yeah.
Sure.
So, was King David raping women, bro?
Absolutely.
He was raping them.
He had something like what was considered, I think it was 1,000 concubines or something like
He
that.
was
For
raping them.
18 his 18 wives were wives. The rest were basically his whores. So
They
yeah,
were 'cause they were concubines. They weren't he wasn't raping them, Halsey.
okay, so we're cutting nickels in that we're saying that okay, it was not forced violent, but it was also was not in any way, shape, or form a virtuous marriage either. They were side women. So they were
That's not
first of
Halsey.
all,
That's not bro. What are
uh,
you talking
okay.
about, dude?
I
That is
just
not
said
rape.
we're splitting the coin in that okay.
No, we're not
I will
splitting
concede
hairs
the
here.
point.
Rape
We're
is a
not
very
talking about a
specific thing, bro. Is the opposite of consent. If you have a concubine, she's consenting. It's the opposite.
no, she's absolutely not consenting. Those women,
What?
the concubines weren't consenting. They were given as gifts. They
Bro.
were
Oh,
received from the
bro.
population. They didn't come and say, "I want to be your
Most
concubine."
concubines came willingly. They wanted to be the other
No.
women because they got fed and they got to live in the big castle and they got to get all sorts of favors. What are you talking about? Under Jewish law, it was illegal. It was illegal.
I understand that it was illegal under law, and I'm what I just said 3 times, which you've ignored 3 times. I'm not talking about the violent taking of women in which they're taken without any form of consent. What I'm talking about is the selling of women, which basically puts them into a position of concubine, in that they're sold by their fathers into a situation in which they have no control and in which they become a concubine. It's not like they made the decision to become a concubine. They were done. It was done without their control. So they were then
No,
made
it was
regarded
bro.
into a position of being a
No,
reproductive organ of a
that's
king who had no
all right.
commitment to
That
it.
is a non-historic standard. Again, when you're talking about concubines or side women for nobility, things like this,
I'm
women,
saying you're the one who brought up King
bro,
David, not me.
most women offered themselves up into those positions because it was an upward mobility station thing. They
They
were able
weren't in
to
a
head up,
position to
bro.
offer themselves up into anything. They didn't have the agency to do so.
What are you?
They had to be
Why didn't they
offered
have
by
the
their
agency? What
father.
are you talking about? What agency did
They
they
didn't
need?
have the agency in that they could go sign themselves up for a concubine. They were
Yes, they
taken as a
did.
concubine.
Yeah.
No,
Why
they
do?
didn't.
Okay, explain this to me. So if a woman wanted to have sex with King David, right?
Right.
Because she thought that that would lead to lots and lots of yummy food and a much better station for where she could live, right? Could she then go and have sex with King David and be one of his concubines?
I mean, yes, I will.
Yes.
Wait. I'll cede a
Yes.
point to you that King David would hang out on the street, and women that had never met him and had no idea what was going on would just be able to walk up to King David and be like, "Hey, use my pussy. I need food." Like I'm quite sure that that
My
happened quite
God.
often. That the king just had intimate contact with any woman that he wanted. That they could come up to him and say, "Let me give you myself."
Okay,
No,
so
that's
let's
not
look at
how it works.
here's a historic standard for you, Halsey. You had to be able
Mhm.
to provide for a woman, okay?
Okay.
If you were a man. For a woman, you only
Mhm.
had to be fertile. That was it. And so
Okay.
because there were so few men who were able to provide for women, right? Provide for a family, things like this, you ended up with the men who had
I
means.
thought you just said it was like 60% that were able to.
Bro, about 60% of men were unable to spread their seed. Unable to. About
Okay. So,
40%
but I'm sorry,
were.
40%. That was
Uh-huh.
just I'm sorry, I made a
Yeah,
mistake.
yeah.
So you're
So
saying only 40% of men could afford to
historically,
have
yeah, that was the
historically, could
standard.
afford to have large harems of concubines
Could afford to have a
that
wife at all.
that that could afford to have a wife at all, but I'm saying they
Mhm.
were able to afford large harems of concubines in which they met them and the concubines came to them willingly and said, "Let me join your
Yeah.
harem of concubines." And
No,
the
not just
men were just
concubines, your harem of wives, your harem of whatever, okay? Asians were notorious for this, okay? Muslims were notorious for this, and there was often harems and concubines and things like this even in what is now broadly considered the West. In Rome, you had many mistresses. Like, this is not news to anybody except you, Halsey. So, the
it's not
historic
news to me.
standard
Well,
the
you're saying
historic
exactly what I
the
said, that
historic
there's a difference
yeah.
between multiple wives and having multiple women that you bang.
Yeah, but the multiple
There's
women that you bang, the idea is if you have mistresses who are there, right, who willingly
I
are
already
there
said that
because it gives you upward
I'm willing to
mobility.
use a different term in
Okay.
that they were not able to just come and offer themselves to the man as if the man had nothing to do and was just sitting around and women were just coming up to him all day going, "Hey, can I join your
No,
harem?"
often
It
these
didn't work
things
like
were
that. They
arranged.
took those women.
No, well, okay, listen, bro, backing up, just so you know, again, in the historic standard, the harems which existed with multitudes of wives and things like this, most children born were not the product of that's what's in contention.
And okay, we keep using that word and I keep saying that fine, I will concede that the
Okay.
term is probably a bad term to use. I'm using the term of that they were brought into a family structure in which they weren't a wife, they weren't acquired through money in terms of that they were acquired as a wife. Traditionally, they were basically slaves in which they were fucked because they, whatever reason, their father sold them. They were found to be to be pretty on some aspect. A lot of people would, a lot of the aristocracy would take the wives and children of various families because they found them attractive. But there was very little idea that a woman made this decision that she was going to walk up to the master of the land and become a concubine. They didn't have the
No,
access.
they were often listen, it's often an arrangement through a man, but that doesn't mean that this was against the woman's, consent or against what the woman actually
She
wanted.
didn't have any
If it
consent one way or
creates
the
if
other.
it creates
She
if
wasn't
it creates
given
upward
the idea of
mobility. First
consent.
of all, this is again a myth. The myth that women had no fucking agency because they couldn't vote or operate in the political sphere. They had tons
I
and
didn't
tons
say anything
bro,
about voting or the
then
political
so then
sphere.
women, even if they had to utilize the access of men to negotiate their own haremship, that means that they couldn't consent. Why?
No, I'm not saying that. What I said was is that they didn't, it's not like they went up to a man and said, "Listen, I need you to go negotiate with the Lord so I can go join his harem." It wasn't like that. The Lord came to the man and said, "I saw these few women out there. I would like to acquire them as part of my harem." And the man said, "Okay, let's work this out." The women had no ability to make any kind of
Yes,
choice
so
in the
you're
matter.
saying that when daughters protested to their fathers and said, "I don't want this, dad," they had no ability to negotiate that on their behalf? Give me a fucking break, Halsey. Again, that's a
You really believe
historical.
that the women had the ability to? I
They
mean,
did
I
it
could
all
show
the
you
time. They
mad
were
mul
listen, when I look at the historic standard, I see that women had moral agency often and were often considered to be moral agents because they weren't part of the political process. Because they weren't part of the political process, who were often looked to in communities as having high moral virtue. High moral virtue. This was a thing which often occurred, in fact. So I don't know where this idea comes from. It's a
So
bizarre
wait a minute,
idea.
they had high moral virtue, but at the same time, they were able to negotiate their positions as concubines because
Well,
of a
yeah,
moral position?
some women negotiated their position as concubines, right? I'm sure some were forced into it, but what I'm saying is that inside the historic standard, women were still considered to be virtuous. They were still considered to be people who had great wisdom. They were considered to be the givers of even medicine in many cases. So the thing is like,
Right, but I'm talking the ones you're talking about
yeah,
are the ones that were raised in that type of environment and then were offered up as wives to different men based on their birth. Like a father would be able to say, I have this level of ability, or I have this
Yeah,
level of
fathers
money,
did
or I have this
arranged
level of this.
marriages, but that's good,
But
Halsey.
those women had virtue, but that
Yeah.
virtue was,
No,
I'm not disagreeing with you.
yeah,
In fact, my
that's
community still
good.
does it.
Yeah,
So
yeah, your community arranges
I'm not
marriages constantly. Like, what's your problem with
all the
arranged
time.
marriages? What? What?
I don't have a problem with arranged marriages. I'm saying that that's not what occurred to the vast majority of the women. They weren't members of the aristocracy.
The
They weren't
vast
married
majority
members.
of women, yes, they engaged in arranged marriages by the father or by their family with their mother, this and that. But was a global phenomenon everywhere. And by the way, still is a global phenomenon almost everywhere, including
I
here.
agree with you, but
Right?
we're
Hang on,
also
right
talking
this
about the difference between
second.
marriage and
Right
concubine.
this
We're talking about two
second.
different
Right
things.
this second. Even in the West, we have this great pretension that we don't do arranged marriages. Parents are
I told you, my community,
yeah,
basically, that's all they
that's
do.
all they do.
So,
Exactly. So it's like it's total
right?
bullshit. It's total bunk, right? Arranged marriages happen constantly. But let me ask you this, Halsey. Are you saying that if you wanted to have an arranged marriage inside of your community and the woman doth protest, that you, the father, would still force her to take that marriage? Oh,
No,
so then
of
why
course
do you
not,
fucking assume they did 500 years ago, Halsey?
because they
It
did.
would be okay. So basically, you're saying that um, that you wouldn't do it, of course, right? And that
No,
your
I'm saying,
community would
like,
do it, but
let's
of
just
course,
use
500 years
no,
ago,
what
the
I'm
men were
saying
way
is
less moral, Halsey. It's stupid.
yes, what I'm saying is that if you look at the Islamic Hadith, if you look at the Gemara by the Jews, if you look at even Christian tradition, there are huge amounts of cases where they talk about how a woman did not have the agency in order to say no to an arranged marriage, or at least to an arranged servitude. That's for sure.
Listen, when you're
But
talking
that
again, what you're doing is
we're putting two no,
no,
what
you're
we're talking about is two
smuggling.
different types of
No,
women. We're talking about
you're
two different types
smuggling
of
a couple of
arrangement.
things in here, right? When we're talking about
No,
agency,
I'm making the
it is the
differentiation
case that
between two different types
the
of arrangements
father's
between
able
women
to
and men.
make the final say. I'm not disputing that. What's in dispute is whether
Right.
or not the woman has a say at all through the patriarchs of their family. It is definitely historically correct that if they raised objections to this, that those objections were adhered to just like they are in modern communities and in modern Muslim communities. Perhaps their objections can go like you can ignore the objections, but they did have the agency to object and often did, Halsey, just like they do
And
right
as I
now.
said, when we're talking about marriages, I agree with you. What I'm not agreeing with you is that the harems that were created were mostly not considered marriages. They were not
I
considered to
never
be
said they
some
were
sort of
considered
arrangement.
marriages.
That's my point, though, is I keep saying this over and over again. Yes, the man had a wife. He might have even had multiple
Yeah.
wives, but he also had, like King David, had 18 wives, but he had 1,000
Yeah.
concubines. Those concubines were not there because all of a sudden they just came up to the king and said, "Let me join your concubine." They wouldn't have
Yeah,
had
but the case
access. They were
okay,
given.
but the case use here again, even if I granted this, we're still when we're looking at the historic standard for harems and things like this, we're looking at
Mhm.
genetic distinctions. It really just boils down to this. Resources were a necessity for men to have wives. Fertility was the only
Sure.
necessity to be a wife, which made the candidacy for a multitude of women much easier for men of resources than the opposition. That's it. That's the whole point.
I wouldn't say that, but I wouldn't say that just reproduction was. I mean, there had to be some level of the ability to rear the children as well.
Resources.
Like I'm saying, if there was a woman that had no arms and no legs and was blind, but she still had the ability to get pregnant, I'm quite sure that she wouldn't have any value to be
Yeah,
sold
okay. Yeah, okay.
to a
Halsey,
harem.
sure. I'll go ahead and grant that women with no arms, no legs, and no ears and no eyeballs,
No, come on, I was being hyperbolic,
fertile,
and you know it.
yeah,
What
them
I'm
just being
saying though
fertile
is that
wasn't enough,
just being
Halsey. You
fertile
got me,
is
Halsey.
never enough.
You got me, Halsey. You're
Oh,
right. You're right. The few women with no eyes, ears,
no,
legs, or
no, 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 no,
arms
no, no,
that
no,
their
no, no.
fertility wasn't
No, no,
enough.
no, 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 no. I know what you're doing, and it's fun that you think that I said I'm just being hyperbolic. I'm just saying that the idea of that just being the ability to have children was not considered to be as virtuous as the ability to have children and to rear those children, which included taking care of a house and a husband.
Yeah, but that's not what's in
So those
dispute. Well, all I need is this baseline agreement that it is in fact the case
okay,
that the barrier for entry to reproduction for a man was resources. The barrier for entry to
sure.
reproduction for a woman was just fertility.
Was the ability to
That's
reproduce
it.
with fertility.
Is it can we agree
I'll
to
be
that?
happy to agree with that
Okay,
baseline.
great. Then I think that even if we're kind of like quibbling about the historic standard and this and that, and these other things, if we can agree on that as a baseline, then in modernity,
Mhm.
right, where we have everything swapped around for the purpose of egalitarianism, okay, the entire
Okay.
world is kind of the opposite of how it used to be, at least in the sense of arranged marriages and things like this, right? It is
Sure.
still, though, the case that men with resources still grab the most amount of women, isn't it?
Sure. No, that's 100%
And it
true.
is the case that the only
Definitely
the
agree with
only
that.
barrier for entry for women for that is basically fertility. So it's just the idea of, hey, we're generally attracted to younger women because younger women are more fertile, right? And so we
Mhm.
associate beauty with youth. And so men of high status are still grabbing
Sure.
young women and well, trying to bang them and this and that. None of that portion has changed. You agree with that, right?
Yep. We'll agree. I'll
Okay, so
definitely
we
agree
can
with
agree
that.
with that standard too. So I guess all of it then leading up to the initial point, if it is the case again that in modernity men are responsible for all security of women, and it is the case that women have a duty towards reproduction, then women are the ones failing their duty, Halsey. They're failing their duty.
Yeah, but it's not because of lack of ability, it's because of lack of desire. But I'm saying I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then if that's the case, then I think you would have to concede then that men, at least in modernity, are more virtuous than women because they're acquiescing to their duty and women are not.
Men are acquiescing to their duty in that they provide resources, and women are not
No, it's
acquiescing
not
to
just
their
that they
duty in that
provide
they're not
resources, they
reproducing.
provide security. That's their great duty. Their great duty to society is the
So
providing of
are you
security.
saying that's different from the past, or are you saying that's the same from the past?
I think that in the past they also had to provide security.
But in the past it was security and resources, and now it's security.
And I think also resources.
So again, I'm asking a clarifying question. I'm
Mhm.
not
Well,
asking a
men
gotcha
have more
question.
resources than
Are
they
you
ever have, and monogamy is not a problem in that sense, that most men can have the resources to support a wife. You know what I mean? Like, there is a section that can't, but most men, at least if they live within their means, can probably support a wife. So, the question just becomes this.
without a wife working, you're saying?
Yeah, it would be it's a tougher life, but you can do it. Like, they're not gonna starve to death.
Listen, I know I've done it
Yeah, I've
myself,
done it
so it's
too. So I'm
I'm
just
not
saying the
saying
point is like ultimately, if that is the case, I think we can finally find a point of agreement when you're talking about security, right? Men are upholding that
Mhm.
duty for security. Women are not upholding the duty towards reproduction. Men are moving towards the security role. They continue to move towards the security role. Women are not moving towards the reproduction role. You say it's due to a lack of
You know what? I'm actually finding an interest in this. How are they moving more towards the security role?
well, they're staying within the confines of the security role. So it's still the case that
Okay, so
society.
you're saying that it's a baseline
Yeah, so the
that those
society is still
existed and is
upholding the
continuing to
idea that
exist.
men need to provide security because society can't work if they don't.
Okay, but again, so let's extrapolate this out a little further, just because
Okay,
again, I'm
I
running
only
this by
got
you
a
more out
couple
of
of minutes
curiosity.
left though, Halsey, because I got a moderated debate for a friend
Right.
of mine. But like
Sure.
I've been enjoying the discussion though.
Did we wanna
Okay, so
open up the panel for the last few moments?
sure. Let's let Andrew
Well,
take the
I
two
mean,
questions so
so
before you got to
my
run.
hard out's basically 10, but I was willing to give Halsey
Right.
here another couple of minutes just so he can make his last points.
No,
Copy that.
I had a more of a curiosity in the security aspect in that we're seeing in Western countries that the people responsible for security, such as border security and things like that, are abdicating that responsibility for mass migration and all of that. So are you saying that the baseline still exists that they're upholding that security when they're not really because they're allowing in, as I said, mass amounts of immigrants, mass amounts of criminals, things like
No,
that? Or is that
they're
just a
not.
political decision that they have no
They're
control
not.
over?
What they're doing is they're voting
Okay.
in mass against that, and they're raging in mass against that, and women are the deciding vote for mass migration, when women are the deciding
But
vote.
I'm saying it's the men that are inherently responsible for guarding the
So
actual
what you're
border, and they're
saying
just
then
letting
so the
them
entailment
through.
of that is that we need to stop women from voting because then we won't have mass migration, right?
Amen. Just repeal the 19th, my friend.
I don't know how else I don't know how you get around it, you know?
No, as I said, I think we disagree on the necessity for immediacy. I don't think repealing the 19th is so necessary. I think that there are very many ways to restrict the franchise of voting that don't require an extreme solution. So,
Well, I don't know. So when this is the thing that gets me, right? Is when people say things like
mhm.
extreme solutions, things like that. It doesn't seem like it's that extreme to me if you have demographics and pockets of the population, men and women even, who are consistently voting to fuck the rest of the population over in exchange for some type of personal interest. In this case, like, oh,
Mhm.
I have family in this other nation, I want them here, or something like this, or I need to lead with empathy. It doesn't seem like it's extreme to say, well, fuck off. We can't have a nation like that.
You see,
You know,
again, I don't necessarily have a strong draw towards democracy, so I would agree with you on that aspect entirely. In that, I don't really feel that democracy matters to me. Like, I really don't. I think community matters more than democracy. So to me, if you build strong communities, I don't care if they're not democratic.
well,
Like,
look, I
I
got
really could care less.
it's 10 o'clock. I appreciate
Yeah, I
it.
hear you. I hear
Halsey,
you.
but there's
So
thousands of listeners, and this was a lot of fun. It was fun to just kind of like dive in and play devil's advocate back and forth with you on various things,
sure,
and you too. But I think that you do kind of understand my baseline position a bit better. It's
sure.
it's done through the position of reason and logic, not done through the position of some kind of bizarre misogyny, like many of these women would have you believe.
I didn't accuse you of being that, and nor would I. So
I mean, you should, because by
I
every metric of the feminist, I would be a misogynist. I'm just very proud of that fact because feminists are lunatics and they have basically they consider anything which is masculine to be misogyny. So
Yeah, but bro, you remember, I'm a member of a tribe that is responsible for every single death and destruction that's ever happened in the history of man and will ever happen in the history of man.
as long as
So
you admit
labels
that,
don't really
Halsey,
bother
as
me all
long as
that
you
much.
admit that, Halsey, that's all I care
I'm
about.
proud of it. Admit it. I'm proud of it. Are you crazy? Why wouldn't I be proud of the fact that I rule the world? I need to move up to the gold standard of the community.